The monitors are the only sound in the room. Then they stop. A man in pressed scrubs stands at the foot of the bed, checking a chart no one asked him to check. He does not look like a man anyone remembers. Quiet voice, tired eyes, the kind of face security cameras forget. Outside the door, the men in black suits stand rigid, earpieces blinking. They are paid to be feared. They are not paid to notice that the nurse beside them has already counted every exit in the building, every angle a gun could come from, every second it would take to reach the girl in that bed before anyone else could. Then the lights cut. Somewhere down the hall, a door that should be locked opens on its own. The guards reach for their radios. The nurse does not move. Not yet, because he already knows what they don't. Whoever is coming for her tonight has no idea who is standing between them and the door. The night shift at Ridgeview Memorial began the same way it always did, with silence pretending to be peace. Ethan Cole moved through the ICU corridor with a tray of medication in one hand and a tablet in the other. His footsteps unhurried, his eyes flicking once over every doorway he passed. Room 402, stable. Room 404, sedated, breathing even. Room 406 empty, waiting for a transfer that would arrive at 6. He was 36 years old, average height. The kind of build that didn't announce itself under scrubs. Brown hair kept short out of habit rather than style. A face that people described, when asked, as kind and then struggled to remember in detail, 5 minutes later. Nurses on his floor liked him. Doctors trusted him. Nobody thought about him twice. That was exactly how he wanted it. Cole, can you check on 400? Vital's monitors throwing a weird reading, said Priya, the charge nurse, not looking up from her station. On it. He said it the way he said everything. Flat.com. Already moving before the sentence finished. In room 409, an elderly man named Harold Weiss lay with a heart monitor blinking an irregular rhythm. Ethan's eyes went to the screen, then to Harold's face, then to the IV line, in under 2 seconds. He didn't need to think through the sequence. His hands had already found the problem before his mind caught up a kinked line. Nothing more, easily fixed. You're okay, Harold, Ethan said quietly, adjusting the tubing. Machine got confused. You didn't, Harold. Half asleep, managed a weak smile. Good hands, he mumbled. Ethan didn't answer. He never did, when people said things like that. He simply finished, checked the readout once more, and left the room the way he'd entered it. Without disturbance, without trace. This was the job. Not saving lives with dramatic gestures, but noticing the small failures before they became large ones. Nobody clapped for a nurse who caught a kinked IV line. Nobody wrote articles about the technician who read a monitor 2 seconds faster than protocol required. That suited him. He had spent years learning that the most dangerous thing a man could do was be noticed. At 2 a.m., during his 15-minute break, Ethan sat alone in the stairwell, not the break room. Never the break room. Too many people, too much noise, and opened a photo on his phone. His daughter Mia, 6 years old, missing her front tooth, grinning at a school carnival 3 weeks ago. He had taken the photo standing slightly apart from the crowd, the way he stood apart from most things now, watching the exits out of a habit he had never been able to switch off. He kept the photo up for exactly 90 seconds. Then he put the phone away, because 90 seconds of feeling like a father was sometimes all he could afford before the ache of it became something he had to carry through the rest of the shift. His ex-wife had left 3 years ago, not because of anything he did, because of everything he didn't say. 2 tours she never asked about, a discharge paperwork folder in a drawer he never opened, a man who came home from a war he never named and tried to become invisible in his own house, the same way he'd learned to become invisible in someone else's. She hadn't left out of anger. She'd left out of exhaustion, trying to love someone who had trained himself not to be seen. Mia lived with him full custody now, a fact that still surprised him some mornings when he came home and found her cereal bowl already washed and set to dry. 6 years old, and already more orderly than most of the men he'd served with. He worked nights so he could walk her to school in the mornings. He had turned down to supervisor promotions because they came with daytime hours and less time with her. And he had never once explained why to anyone who asked. Back on the floor, Priya caught him at the nurse's station near 3 a.m. You're too calm for this job, Cole, she said, only half joking, sliding a coffee toward him he hadn't asked for. Weiss's granddaughter said you were the only person on this floor who didn't panic when his monitor went off. Everyone else was already reaching for the crash cart. Nothing to panic about, Ethan said. It was a line, not a heart. How'd you know that fast? He shrugged, the gesture practiced, worn smooth from years of use. Lucky guess. It wasn't luck. It had never been luck. But luck was a story people accepted, without asking further questions. And Ethan Cole had built his entire second life on giving people exactly enough truth to stop them from looking for more. He finished his coffee, checked his watch, and turned back down the hallway, toward room 409 to check on Harold Weiss one more time before dawn, moving quietly, competently, invisibly, through a building full of people who had no idea what kind of man was walking among them. Somewhere 2 floors up, though he didn't know it yet, a black SUV was already pulling into the hospital's private entrance, carrying a girl whose accident hadn't been an accident at all. The private elevator opened at 4:40 a.m., and 4 men in dark suits stepped out first, sweeping the hallway with the practiced boredom of people who had done this 100 times and expected nothing to go wrong tonight either. Behind them, a gurney rolled out, flanked by 2 paramedics and a hospital administrator, who had been pulled out of bed 40 minutes earlier with a phone call that used the words Whitfield Industries and immediate discretion in the same sentence. Ethan was at the far end of the corridor, restocking a supply cart when the elevator doors opened. He didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. He counted them in his periphery, the way he counted everything. 4 guards, 1 gurney, 1 girl, 16 years old, maybe 17. Pale, unconscious, but breathing on her own. A laceration above her left eyebrow, bruising along the collarbone. A brace stabilizing her neck as a precaution. He kept restocking gauze pads. His hands didn't slow, but his eyes had already done what 15 years of training had never let him stop doing. The bruising pattern was wrong. A car accident produced certain injuries in certain places. Seatbelt bruising diagonal across the chest. Impact trauma consistent with airbag deployment. Glass lacerations, scattered and shallow. What he saw on the girl's collarbone as the gurney passed was a single, deep linear bruise. Narrow, deliberate. The kind of mark left by something gripping, not something crashing. He filed it away and said nothing. Saying something would have required explaining how he knew the difference. And that was a door he had spent 3 years welding shut. Room 412. Isolate the wing, the administrator was saying to Priya. Breathless, official folder clutched to her chest. Families requesting minimum staff contact. Mr. Whitfield will have his own security posted at all times. Hospital security is to defer to them completely. Priya's eyebrows lifted a fraction, but she nodded. Understood. I'll assign a primary nurse and keep the rotation tight. Make it someone senior, someone who won't ask questions. Ethan, 20 feet away, heard every word. He had learned long ago that the quietest man in the room heard the most. By 6 a.m., he was assigned to room 412 as backup on the rotation, not primary. But close enough to observe, he entered to check vitals and found the room arranged like a fortress in miniature. 1 guard stood inside the door itself, arms crossed, watching Ethan's every movement with the flat suspicion of a man who distrusted anyone in scrubs on principle. Another stood in the hallway. 2 more, he guessed, were posted at the stairwell and the private elevator. The girl the chart read Sophia Whitfield, 16, lay still, an IV in her arm. Monitors tracking a heartbeat that was steady, but faster than it should have been for someone sedated this deeply. Just checking vitals, Ethan said to the guard by the door, voice even on. The guard didn't move aside. Make it quick. Ethan did. He worked with the economy of motion that came from a lifetime of not wasting energy on things that didn't matter. Blood pressure, pulse, oxygen saturation, all logged in under 90 seconds. But in that 90 seconds, his eyes moved where his hands didn't. The 4-line had been placed correctly, professionally. A paramedic's work, not a struggle. That told him something. Whoever had hurt this girl hadn't wanted her to die. They'd wanted her taken, and someone had interrupted that plan before it finished. He glanced at the guard by the door again. Young, fit, a sidearm under the jacket. Poorly concealed for someone supposedly trained in close protection. His eyes kept drifting to his phone rather than the room. Private security, Ethan thought. Ex-police maybe. Good enough to look intimidating in a boardroom. Not good enough for what might actually be coming. She's stable, the guard asked, without much real interest. She's stable, Ethan said. But whoever did this wasn't trying to kill her. The guard's eyes narrowed slightly, the first flicker of real attention Ethan had seen from him. What makes you say that? Ethan almost answered honestly, almost said, the bruising pattern is a restraint mark, not an impact injury. And the 4 was placed by someone competent under pressure. Which means this wasn't chaos, it was controlled. Almost said, someone tried to take her, and something went wrong for them, not for her. Instead, he shrugged. The same practiced motion from a few hours earlier. Just a guess. I'll let the doctors handle the details. He finished logging her vitals. gave the monitor one last glance. Heart rate still slightly elevated, the kind of thing that could mean lingering fear even under sedation, and left the room. In the hallway, he paused for exactly 3 seconds outside the door, longer than a normal nurse would, long enough to notice that the security camera mounted at the end of the corridor was angled 2 degrees off from where it should have been, aimed slightly toward the stairwell instead of dead-on down the hall. It could have been nothing, a maintenance adjustment, a loose mount, or it could have been someone, already inside the building, making sure a blind spot existed exactly where they'd need one. Ethan didn't report it. Not yet. He simply memorized the angle, the time, and the guard's badge number. The way he memorized everything now, quietly, without explanation, the old instincts waking up one careful step at a time. By 8 a.m., the 4th floor had changed shape. What had been an ordinary ICU wing, soft alarms, quiet footsteps, the low hum of machines keeping people alive, was now something closer to a checkpoint. Whitfield Industries had sent 6 more men overnight, bringing the total to 10. All dressed in the same dark suits, all carrying themselves with the same rehearsed authority. A folding table had been set up near the elevator, manned by 2 of them, checking IDs against a list for anyone entering the wing, hospital staff included. Ethan clocked out at 7:15, slept for hours in the small apartment he shared with Mia, walked her to school at 8:40, and was back at the hospital by 9:30. Not for his shift, which didn't start again until that night, but because Priya had texted him, "Something's off up here. Could use a second set of eyes, if you're free." He didn't ask what she meant. He already had a guess. When he arrived, he found her in the break room, arms crossed, staring at nothing. They took over the whole nurses' station, Priya said before he'd even sat down. Told Denise she couldn't access Sophia's chart without their approval. Told Dr. Rana he needed to be cleared before doing rounds. This is a hospital, Ethan, not their private compound. Who's running their team? Guy named Marcus Reyes. Ex-military, I think. From the way he talks. Not unreasonable, exactly. Just territorial. Like we're the threat. Ethan filed the name away. Marcus Reyes, ex-military. That was worth knowing. He found Reyes 20 minutes later, standing near the nurse's station reviewing something on a tablet, radio clipped to his shoulder, posture too straight for a man who'd been awake all night. The posture of someone still running on discipline rather than rest. Mid-40s gray at the temples. A scar along his jaw that had healed clean. The kind of scar that came from a blade, not an accident. Ethan recognized the bearing immediately. Special forces. Probably, maybe Ranger Battalion. A man who had once been very good at his job, and now spent his skills guarding corporate assets for triple the pay and none of the purpose. "You're the one who checked her vitals earlier," Reyes said, without looking up from the tablet. Not a question. "I did. You said something to Delgado about the injuries not matching a car accident." Now he looked up, his eyes were sharp, assessing, the kind of look that measured a man in half a second, and rarely got it wrong. "Care to explain that to me instead of my guard?" Ethan met his gaze evenly. This was the moment to disappear back into the wallpaper. Shrugged. Say it was a guess. Walk away. He'd done it a dozen times in the last 6 hours. But something in Reyes's posture told him a shrug wouldn't work twice on this man. The bruise on her collarbone is linear and deep, consistent with a grip, not an impact, Ethan said, keeping his voice flat, clinical, a nurse reciting an observation rather than a soldier reading a scene. Airbag and seatbelt trauma spreads across a wider area. What she has is localized. That's not typical for a collision. Reyes studied him for a long moment. "You're a nurse. I'm a nurse. Where'd you train?" "Community college. Then here." "True. Technically. Just not the whole story." Reyes didn't push further, but Ethan saw the flicker, the same flicker he'd have had himself. Meeting someone whose competence didn't match their file. Reyes filed it away, the way professionals filed away anomalies, to be revisited later if it mattered. "Appreciate the observation," Reyes said finally, turning back to his tablet. Dismissing him, the way people in charge dismissed people they'd decided weren't a threat. "Stay out of the room unless you're on rotation. We've got this covered." "You don't," Ethan thought, but didn't say it. He walked the perimeter of the wing once more, before leaving, not obviously, just a nurse doing a nurse's rounds, checking supply closets, glancing into rooms, exchanging small talk with 2 other staff members. In that walk, he noted 3 things Reyes's team had missed. First, the badge reader at the west stairwell had logged an entry at 3:52 a.m., 12 minutes before the Whitfield security detail's own arrival. Log began from a maintenance badge that hadn't been used in 6 weeks, according to the sign-in sheet taped beside it. Second, the security camera in the east hallway. The one he'd noticed angled wrong the night before was still angled wrong. Nobody had adjusted it. Nobody had even looked. Third, and this was the one that settled cold in his chest, one of Reyes's own men, stationed near the supply room, had a visitor's badge under his jacket that didn't match the others. A different color strip, a different clearance level, small enough that most people would never notice. Ethan noticed, because noticing inconsistencies in a room full of armed men had once been the difference between his team going home and not. He didn't say anything to Reyes. Not yet. Trust had to be earned in both directions. And right now, all he had were fragments, a badge, a camera angle, a bruise that didn't match a story. Not proof. Not yet. But instinct, the old instinct he'd buried under 3 years of quiet hospital corridors, was awake now, fully awake, whispering the thing it had whispered before every mission that had gone sideways in his old life. Something is already inside the wire. He left the hospital at 10:15, walked home slower than usual, and sat for a long time at his kitchen table without turning on the light, thinking not about Sophia Whitfield, not about Marcus Reyes, but about Mia, about the version of his life he had built specifically so he would never again have to be the man who noticed things like this. He hoped, quietly and without much conviction, that he was wrong. He was not wrong. The false emergency happened at 11:47 p.m., during Ethan's second shift back on the floor. He was 3 doors down from room 412, helping a junior nurse reposition an elderly patient, when the code alarm tore through the wing, a full cardiac alert, originating from Sophia Whitfield's room. The reaction was instant and loud. Reyes's men surged toward the door, radios crackling, 2 of them drawing closer to the room than protocol allowed, boots too heavy on a floor that was supposed to stay quiet. Dr. Rana came sprinting from the nurse's station. Priya was already grabbing the crash cart. Ethan didn't run. He walked, fast, purposeful, but not running, because in the 2 seconds before his body reacted, something in the shape of the sound had already told him what his ears refused to accept as normal. The alarm tone was right. The volume was right. But underneath it, so faint most people would never separate it from the panic in the hallway, was a half-second delay between the monitor's audible alarm and the visual strobe on the wall panel outside the room. Real cardiac alerts didn't have that delay. Manufactured ones triggered manually from a maintenance override rather than the patient's actual vitals sometimes did. He reached the door 6 seconds after Reyes's men. But he reached it already thinking 2 steps ahead of everyone else in the hallway. Inside, Sophia Whitfield lay exactly as she had for the last 2 days, asleep, breathing evenly, heart rate steady on the monitor. No crisis. No code. The alarm blared from a machine reporting numbers that didn't match the girl in the bed. She's fine, Dr. Rana said, confused, checking the readout against the patient. Vitals are completely normal. This doesn't make sense. Equipment malfunction, said one of Reyes's guards, already reaching to silence the alarm. Don't touch it yet, Ethan said. It came out sharper than he meant it to. The first time in 3 years his voice had carried that particular edge. The tone that expected to be obeyed rather than considered. Every head in the room turned toward him. Reyes, who had just arrived at the door, went still. Ethan lowered his voice back to something ordinary. If it's a malfunction, we log it before resetting. Standard protocol. A reasonable explanation, delivered a half-second too late to hide what had actually driven the command. He crossed to the monitor and checked the connection cables at the back of the machine. Not the front, where anyone would look first, but the back, where a manual override port sat beside the standard input. He'd seen ports like it before, on equipment far more dangerous than hospital monitors. An access point meant for calibration, not meant to be touched during patient care. The port's cover was unscrewed, not broken. Unscrewed recently, carefully, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Reyes appeared beside him, close enough that Ethan felt the man's attention sharpen like a blade being drawn. What are you looking at? Somebody accessed this port in the last hour, Ethan said, keeping his tone level, clinical. It's not damaged. It's been opened deliberately. Why would someone fake a cardiac alert? Ethan already had the answer. The same answer that had been building in his chest since the linear bruise on Sophia's collarbone. Since the badge that logged in 12 minutes before it should have, since the camera angled 2 degrees toward, a blind spot no one had bothered to fix, to see how fast the room clears, to see who runs toward danger and who runs away from it, and how long it takes for the hallway outside this room to empty of anyone paying attention. To test your response time, Ethan said instead. True, just not the whole shape of the truth. Someone wanted to know how fast this room gets flooded, and how empty the hallway gets when it does. Reyes's jaw tightened. He turned, sharp and fast, and barked an order into his radio. Check the hallway cameras. Check the stairwell. Account for every man on the floor. His team scattered to comply, and for the first time since Ethan had met him, Marcus Reyes looked like a man who understood he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he hadn't even seen yet. Ethan stayed by the monitor, screwing the access panel cover back into place with a small screwdriver from his utility kit. The same motion, the same stillness in his hands that he used for every ordinary task on the floor. No one in the room noticed that his eyes never stopped moving the entire time. To the window, to the door, to the ceiling vent, to the space beneath the bed. Cataloging, clearing, the way a man clears a room. Without ever admitting that's what he's doing. Sophia stirred faintly in her sleep, brow furrowing, as if some distant part of her sensed the danger that had just passed within feet of her and receded again, unresolved. Later, in the hallway, Reyes found him restocking a supply cart. The same posture, the same quiet competence Ethan wore like a second skin. That was a good catch, Reyes said. Not warm assessing. Lucky, Ethan said. Twice in 2 days isn't luck. Reyes studied him another long moment, the scar along his jaw catching the fluorescent light. I've spent 20 years reading people who are more than their file says. You're one of them. Ethan said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. Whoever did this isn't finished, Reyes said quietly, almost to himself, looking back toward room 412. They weren't trying to hurt her tonight. They were mapping us. He looked at Ethan again, and this time there was something almost like a question in his eyes. Not suspicion exactly, but the beginning of it. Stay close to this floor tomorrow, Cole. Whatever you are. He walked away before Ethan could decide whether that had been a warning, a request, or the first thread of a truth Reyes hadn't fully pulled yet. Ethan finished restocking the cart in silence, hands steady, heart rate exactly where 3 years of discipline had trained it to stay no matter what. But somewhere behind his calm face, the old part of him, the part he'd buried under night shifts and school drop-offs and a life built entirely around never being seen, was already running the numbers. They were mapping us, which means the real move is still coming. Ethan did not sleep well that morning. He lay in the small bedroom of his apartment, listening to Mia's cartoons through the wall, his mind still walking the 4th-floor corridor, still counting exits, still turning the unscrewed access panel over and over like a stone he couldn't put down. By the time he picked her up from school that afternoon, he had already made a decision he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet. Daddy, you're quiet today, Mia said, swinging his hand as they walked, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Just thinking, sweetheart. About work. A little. She accepted this the way 6-year-olds accepted most things, without needing more, and launched into a detailed account of a disagreement with a classmate over crayons. Ethan listened, nodded in the right places, and felt the familiar ache of loving someone so much that every risk he might take suddenly weighed twice as heavy. He made her dinner, read her half a chapter of a book about a dragon who was afraid of loud noises, and sat with her until she fell asleep. Then he went to the small closet in his bedroom, pulled down a shoebox from the top shelf, and opened it for the first time in over a year. Inside were the things he never looked at. A folded flag, still in its case. A photograph of 8 men in desert fatigues, one of them missing now. Another walking with a prosthetic leg somewhere in Colorado. A challenge coin worn smooth from being turned over and over in someone's pocket. His own pocket. Once, before he'd decided that carrying it meant carrying everything that came with it. He didn't take anything out. He simply looked, for exactly as long as he allowed himself these things, and then closed the box and put it back. Not yet, he told himself. Not unless there's no other way. But something in him had already shifted. And by the time he arrived at the hospital that night, the shift showed in small, deliberate actions no one around him would consciously notice, though several would remember them later. He requested a rotation change, trading a shift with a colleague, so that his hours overlapped more heavily with the guard rotation. Outside room 412, not enough to draw attention, just enough to be present during the hours he'd calculated were most vulnerable. The long stretch between 2 and 5 a.m., when even trained men's attention began to fray. He walked the east stairwell twice during his break, timing it, memorizing the rhythm of the badge reader, noting that the camera angled toward the blind spot still hadn't been corrected a full day after he'd flagged the discrepancy. Internally, through a maintenance ticket he'd filed under a mundane complaint about flickering. Number 1 had prioritized it. No one but him seemed to understand yet what that blind spot meant. He began memorizing faces, not just the 10 Whitfield guards, but every hospital staff member who came anywhere near the 4th floor. The cafeteria delivery man, the new respiratory therapist covering for someone on leave, the maintenance worker who'd been in twice this week for a ventilation issue that, as far as Ethan could tell, didn't exist. He catalogued badge numbers, shift times, small inconsistencies, the same instinct that had once kept a 12-man team alive, now quietly rebuilding itself. Inside the walls of a hospital, where nobody expected to need it, Marcus Reyes noticed first. He found Ethan near the supply room at 3 a.m., standing at an angle that gave him a clear sightline down both the east stairwell and the door to room 412 simultaneously, a position no ordinary nurse would think to occupy, because no ordinary nurse thought in terms of sightlines at all. "You've been on this floor 11 hours out of the last 16, Reyes said, arms crossed, voice low enough not to carry. "That's not a nurse's schedule. That's a watch rotation." Ethan didn't flinch, didn't reach for an excuse. He'd learned that over-explaining was its own kind of confession. "I noticed some things yesterday nobody followed up on. Like the camera angle." Like the camera angle. Reyes studied him, and this time the assessment in his eyes had changed shape. Less suspicion, more the particular attention of a man recognizing a piece of equipment he hadn't realized was in the room. "I pulled your personnel file this afternoon," he said. "Community college nursing program. 3 years at this hospital before that. 2 years somewhere in the Midwest. Clean, unremarkable." A pause. Deliberate. "To clean, maybe. I've seen files built to look unremarkable before. I used to help build them myself. I'm just a nurse." "Marcus, sure." Reyes didn't push it further. Not yet. Ethan understood. Not a dismissal, but a patience. A man deciding to let a mystery unfold, rather than force it open before it was ready. "Whoever you are, you're the only person on this floor who's caught anything real in the last 2 days. My own team hasn't found a thing since the alarm." He exhaled, some of the rigid authority in his posture softening into something closer to exhaustion. "I've got 10 men, and none of them have your eyes." "Then use mine," Ethan said quietly, unofficially. "I'll flag what I see. You act on it. Nobody needs to know anything more than that." It was a small thing. On its surface, a nurse offering to keep watching, a security chief agreeing to listen. But both men understood, in the space between the words, that something larger had just shifted. A line had moved, not fully crossed, just moved, the way a man edges a door open an inch before deciding whether to walk through. Reyes extended a hand, and Ethan shook it, a brief, firm grip that carried in it an old language neither man spoke aloud but both recognized instantly. The particular calibration of a handshake between two people who had once been trained the same way, by the same country, for reasons neither of them discussed anymore. "Whatever's coming," Reyes said, releasing his hand. "I think it's close." Ethan looked past him, down the corridor toward room 400, where a 16-year-old girl slept without knowing how many quiet decisions were already being made to keep her alive. "It's already here," Ethan said. "We just haven't seen its face yet." He was right. He would see it in less than 18 hours. It began, as these things always do in hindsight, with something so small, nobody flagged it, in time. At 1:14 a.m., a maintenance work order came through the hospital's facilities system routine, pre-approved 3 days earlier, for 2 technicians to inspect a ventilation fault on the 4th floor. The badge numbers matched. The paperwork matched. The uniforms, when the 2 men stepped off the service elevator carrying toolboxes and a ladder, matched exactly what maintenance workers wore on any given night. Ethan clocked them from the nurse's station, 40 feet away, and felt something in his chest go very still and very cold. He didn't know their faces. He didn't need to. He knew the way they walked. Too even, too quiet. Boots placed with a precision that had nothing to do with carrying tools. He knew the way their eyes moved, sweeping the corridor in the same methodical arc he'd once taught junior operators to use when clearing an unfamiliar space. And he knew, with total certainty, that the ventilation fault they were supposedly there to fix had never existed. He'd filed that maintenance flag himself, 2 days ago, about a camera angle, not about ventilation. Someone had built a second work order on top of his own, using it as cover. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He picked up the nurse's station phone with the same unhurried motion he used for everything. Dialed Reyes's direct line, and said 4 words when the man answered. 4th floor. Now, compromised. Then the lights went out, not just dimmed cut. The entire wing dropping into the disoriented dark of emergency lighting kicking in a half-second late. Red strips glowing dim along the floor while every monitor in every room, screamed its own separate alarm into the sudden black. Somewhere below, a transformer had been taken offline, deliberately, by someone who understood exactly which breaker fed which section of the building. In the chaos, Ethan moved. He didn't move toward the noise, the way Reyes's men did, converging loudly on the maintenance elevator where the two technicians had vanished. He moved toward room 412, the real target, the only thing in this entire building that mattered, cutting through a supply corridor he had memorized 3 nights ago, specifically because it was faster than the hallway, and invisible from the nurse's station. He reached the door as a third guard, a real one of Reyes's went down. It happened fast and quiet, the way real violence happens. Nothing like the noise Ethan had grown up watching in movies before he'd learned better. A man in a dark jacket, not the maintenance uniform, stepped from the stairwell shadow and put the guard on the floor, with 2 precise strikes before the man's hand had even fully closed around his sidearm. Trained, fast, economical. Attacker turned toward room 412's door and saw Ethan standing between him and it. For 1 full second, neither man moved. Ethan watched the calculation happen behind the stranger's eyes. Nurse, unarmed, not a threat. The same calculation every single person in this building had made about him for 3 years. The calculation he had spent 3 years cultivating on purpose. The man lunged for the door handle instead of for Ethan, dismissing him entirely. And that dismissal cost him. Ethan didn't throw a punch. He didn't need to. He caught the man's extended arm, used the attacker's own forward momentum against him, and redirected it into the wall beside the door. Controlled, precise. No more force than necessary to put the man down without breaking anything that would draw attention through the chaos already filling the hallway. It was the kind of move that looked, to anyone watching in the dim red emergency light, like an accident. A man losing his footing in the dark. It was not an accident. The attacker hit the ground hard enough to lose his breath, and Ethan had his wrist pinned and a knee against his shoulder blade before the man could reorient. In the man's jacket, half visible, Ethan caught sight of a small radio earpiece, and, beneath it, the edge of a tattoo he recognized instantly. Not a gang mark, not decoration, but a unit designation from a private military contracting group that had drifted, in recent years, from legitimate security work into something closer to organized not random criminals. Ethan thought, his pulse steady, his mind already 3 steps ahead. Professionals. Someone paid for this. Who sent you? Ethan said quietly, no anger in it. Just the flat certainty of a man who had asked this question before in far worse places. The man said nothing, twisting once against the hold before understanding correctly that fighting it would only cost him more. Down the hall, Reyes's voice was shouting orders, boots pounding. The second attacker apparently cornered near the service elevator. Lights flickered, some emergency circuits stabilizing, the building's automated systems fighting their way back online. Ethan zip-tied the man's wrists with a length of 4 tubing. Improvised, functional, exactly the kind of thing that would never look suspicious, lying loose on a hospital floor, and left him restrained against the wall as Reyes came sprinting around the corner. Weapon drawn, eyes wide taking in the scene, a downed guard, a restrained attacker, and Ethan Cole, standing calm and untouched in the middle of it, breathing exactly as evenly as he had been 10 minutes earlier. He's contained, Ethan said, before Reyes could ask anything. Your man needs medical attention, not urgent. Mostly wind knocked out of him. There was a second one at the elevator. Contained. My guys have him. Reyes stared at the restrained man on the floor, then at Ethan, and something settled into his expression. Not shock, exactly, but the final piece of a puzzle, locking into place. You put him down. He went for the door. I was in the way. Cold. Reyes's voice had an edge to it now, something almost pleading beneath the authority. What are you? Ethan looked past him, toward room 400, where he could see through the door left ajar in the confusion. Sophia Whitfield had woken, sitting up in the dark, eyes wide with the particular terror of a 16-year-old, realizing the thing she'd feared, without being told, was finally, truly here. Later, Ethan said, get your man to the ER. I need to check on her. He walked into the room without waiting for permission, already talking softly, already doing the work of calming a frightened girl, the way he had once calmed frightened men twice her size in far darker places. Voice low, hands visible, movements slow. Behind him, Marcus Reyes stood in the ruined hallway, looking down at a professionally restrained attacker, and understood with total clarity that everything he thought he knew about the quiet nurse on this floor had just been proven wrong in the space of 90 seconds. The breach had been stopped. It had not, Ethan already knew, been finished. By 3 a.m., the 4th floor had been sealed. Hospital security, local police, and Reyes's own team worked in overlapping circles of tape and radios, and the restrained attacker had been handed over to 2 detectives, who arrived asking questions nobody on scene could fully answer yet. Sophia Whitfield sat wrapped in a blanket at the edge of her bed, refusing to lie back down, her eyes fixed on the door every time it opened. Ethan stayed with her, not because his rotation required it, but because he had recognized, in the rigid set of her shoulders, the particular kind of fear that didn't respond to sedatives, only to the presence of someone who didn't flinch. "They're not going to stop, are they?" she said quietly, not really a question. Ethan considered lying to her. He decided against it. "I don't know yet, but you're safer right now than you were an hour ago." "That's true, and it matters. My dad thinks money can fix anything." Her voice cracked slightly. "He hired all these guards, and none of them," she stopped herself, glancing toward the door where a wounded guard had been carried out 20 minutes earlier. "They did their job as well as they were trained to," Ethan said. "This wasn't a fair fight for them. It wasn't supposed to be, but it was for you." He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. She was 16, not stupid, and she had watched. Through a gap in the doorway, a nurse disarmed a trained attacker with the calm efficiency of someone who had done far worse things in far worse places. It was Reyes who found him 20 minutes later, stepping into the small supply alcove where Ethan had gone to actually look, for the first time since the breach began. At his own left forearm, a shallow cut, taken during the struggle, that he hadn't registered until the adrenaline had started to recede. "You're bleeding," Reyes said. "It's nothing. Let me see it." Ethan hesitated, a small hesitation, but Reyes caught it, the way he caught everything now, and reached out before Ethan could pull back, turning his forearm toward the light. The cut was minor. What sat 2 inches above it was not. A tattoo, faded with age but still legible. A trident, small and unadorned, the kind of mark men earned rather than chose. Inked not for decoration, but as a quiet, permanent record of something they had survived. Reyes went very still, staring at it, and Ethan watched the last piece of the puzzle complete itself behind the man's eyes. "Seal," Reyes said, very quietly. Not a question. Ethan pulled his arm back and rolled his sleeve down, slow and deliberate, buying himself a few seconds he didn't really need. "That part of my life is over." "It's clearly not. Given the last hour." "It's over," Ethan repeated, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before. Not defensiveness, but grief. Old and carefully managed. "I have a daughter, 6 years old. Her mother left because she couldn't live with what I brought home from 3 deployments. Even the parts I never talked about. I took this job specifically because nobody here would ever need the man I used to be. I built an entire life around not being him again." Reyes was quiet for a long moment. Outside the alcove, radios crackled. Detectives called out instructions. The ordinary chaos of an aftermath rolling on without them. "That man just saved a 16-year-old girl's life tonight," Reyes said finally. "And probably mine. And 2 of my guys. Whether they know it yet or not, I know." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's the cost. I don't get to choose when he's needed. I only get to choose whether I show up when he is." What happens now? To the daughter? To the life? That was the real question, and Ethan didn't have a clean answer for it. If this went public, if the detectives, the hospital board, the press eventually pieced together what had actually happened in that hallway, the careful invisibility he had built for Mia's sake would be gone. Reporters would find his name. His old unit, still active in classified capacities, would have opinions about a former operator's face appearing in headlines. And somewhere in a school 3 miles away, a 6-year-old girl who thought her father was simply a tired, gentle nurse would have to learn that he was something else entirely, something that might make her, too, a target for whoever had sent men into this hospital tonight. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in 3 years. "But she was in that room. Whatever it costs me, I wasn't going to let her be the reason I finally decided staying invisible mattered more than a life." Reyes studied him, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to respect, hard-won and quiet. The recognition of one soldier for another, regardless of the uniforms they'd worn since. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm not going to be the one who puts your name in a report if I don't have to. They'll ask questions. Detectives already noticed how the first man went down. Let them ask. I'll handle what I can handle." Reyes extended his hand again, the same brief, firm grip from 2 nights earlier. Except this time, it carried the full weight of what both men now understood about each other. "Whatever's still coming. Cole, I'd rather have you beside me than guessing at who you are." Ethan shook his hand. feeling the old current pass between them, the language of men who had given years of their lives to something larger than themselves and paid for it in ways nobody outside that world ever fully understood. "It's not finished," Ethan said quietly, echoing his own words from the night before. 2 men doesn't cover 10 weeks of a company planning this. Somebody wanted her badly enough to risk hitting a hospital directly. That kind of money and patience doesn't walk away because one attempt failed. Reyes's face hardened, the exhaustion in it burning away into something colder, more focused. "Then we'd better be ready for the next one." Down the hall, through the doorway of room 412, Sophia Whitfield sat wrapped in her blanket, watching the 2 men outside her door, with the dawning understanding of a girl who now knew, with absolute certainty, that the quiet nurse who'd checked her vitals 2 nights ago was the only reason she was still breathing. She didn't know yet how much more it would cost him before this was over. Neither, fully, did he. The second attempt came 2 nights later, and this time, Ethan was ready for it before it began. He had spent the intervening 48 hours doing the quiet work Reyes's louder team couldn't, not confrontation, but reconstruction, pulling badge logs, cross-referencing the maintenance work order against the facility's contractor's actual employee roster, which showed no record of either man who'd walked onto the 4th floor 2 nights earlier, studying the tattoo on the restrained attacker, now in police custody, that matched a private contracting outfit called Kestrel Solutions, a company that, according to a business registry search Ethan ran from a public library terminal rather than his own name, had been retained 11 months earlier by a rival conglomerate, locked in a hostile bid to acquire Whitfield Industries. It wasn't a kidnapping for ransom, it was leverage. A father who controlled the deciding shares of his company would fold to almost any demand if his daughter's life sat on the other side of the negotiation. Ethan gave what he'd found to Reyes and, through him, to the detectives, without ever attaching his own name to the source. Reyes didn't ask how a night shift nurse had assembled a corporate ownership trail in 2 days. He'd stopped asking questions he already suspected he didn't want fully answered. What none of them knew, what Ethan himself only pieced together at 11 p.m. on the 3rd night, standing in the stairwell reviewing the badge logs one more time, was that Kestrel Solutions had a 3rd team already inside the building, embedded not as maintenance workers or intruders, but as a contract respiratory therapist who had been covering shifts on the 4th floor for 6 days, hired through a legitimate staffing agency, with a background check clean enough to pass because it had been built, deliberately, months in advance. Her name, according to hospital records, was Danielle Cho. Ethan had spoken to her twice in passing. Competent, quiet, unremarkable, exactly the kind of person nobody looked at twice. He realized it at 11:47 p.m., watching her badge in and out of a supply closet that had no reason for a respiratory therapist to enter, and felt the same cold certainty settle into his chest that he'd felt watching the 2 fake maintenance workers step off the elevator 3 nights before. He didn't call it in immediately. He followed her instead, the old discipline taking over completely now, no hesitation left in it, and watched her make her way, unhurried, toward room 412, where a single Whitfield guard stood post, relaxed after 3 quiet days, trusting a face he'd seen on this floor for nearly a week. Ethan closed the distance fast and silent. He reached the door 6 seconds before Danielle Cho did, stepping into the guard's line of sight, with a clipboard in hand, the picture of routine. "Vitals check," he said to the guard. "Easy, unremarkable, won't take long." The guard nodded, distracted, and Ethan slipped past him into the room, positioning himself between the door and Sophia's bed with the same unhurried motion he'd used 100 times on this floor. Danielle Cho arrived 30 seconds later and found the room already occupied. "I need to check her respiratory function," she said, pleasant, professional. Nothing in her posture to suggest anything other than routine care. "Won't take long either. She's already stable. I just finished." Ethan didn't move from his position. "I'll flag Dr. Rana if anything changes." For a moment, nothing happened. 2 professionals, each recognizing something in the other's stillness that didn't belong to the roles they were performing. Ethan watched her eyes, not at his face, but at the exits. The same calculation he made in every room he entered, and understood, with total certainty, that he was looking at someone exactly like himself, trained the same way, sent here for the opposite purpose. "You're not going to let me in that door," she said quietly. Not a question anymore. "No." Her hand moved toward her scrub pocket fast, and Ethan moved faster, closing the distance and catching her wrist before the syringe inside it. Not a weapon in the traditional sense, but something worse. A fast-acting sedative meant to drop a 16-year-old girl, quietly enough that no alarm would ever sound. Cleared the fabric. The fight that followed lasted 11 seconds and made almost no sound. She was good, trained, fast, willing to hurt him to get past him. But Ethan had spent 15 years being better than good, and every motion he made was built for exactly this. Not to punish her, not to prove anything, but to end the confrontation as quickly and cleanly as possible before Sophia, now awake and pressed against the headboard in silent terror, became collateral in a struggle that had nothing to do with her choices and everything to do with the price on her life. He disarmed the syringe hand first, twisted her off balance, and put her face down against the floor with a control hold that left no room for a second attempt. All without raising his voice above the volume of ordinary hospital conversation. The guard, alerted by the muffled struggle, burst in half a second too late to do anything except stare. "Call Reyes," Ethan said, calm, breathing even, knee planted between Danielle Cho's shoulder blades. "Tell him the threat wasn't outside." It was already staffed in by the time Reyes arrived. The room had gone quiet again. Sophia wrapped once more in a blanket, shaking but unhurt. Danielle Cho restrained and silent on the floor, refusing to speak even as detectives arrived to take her into custody. Reyes looked at Ethan for a long moment before speaking, taking in the scene with the particular exhaustion of a man who had just watched, for the second time in a week, the true shape of the danger he'd been hired to stop. "She's been on this floor 6 days, Reyes said quietly. 6 days. And none of us saw it. You did, in what, 30 seconds? "I've had practice not being seen either," Ethan said. "It makes you good at spotting other people doing the same thing." Later, after the detectives had taken their statements, after Sophia had finally, exhausted, fallen into real sleep with her father sitting in a chair beside her bed, for the first time since she'd been admitted, a man Ethan had not yet met, gray-faced and silent, holding his daughter's hand like he understood, now, exactly how close he'd come to losing her. Reyes found Ethan alone in the stairwell, sitting on the steps, the way he had that very first night, 3 days that felt like a much longer stretch of his life ago. "It's over," Reyes said. "Whitfield's already pulling every lever he has. Kestrel Solutions is finished. The rival company that hired them is going to be buried in federal charges within the week. Nobody's coming for her again." "Good. You should let him thank you properly. He's already asking who you are." Ethan looked up at him, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I don't want that." "I know," Reyes said. "That's exactly why I believe you actually did this for the right reasons." Below them, through the stairwell's small window, the first gray edge of dawn was beginning to show over the parking structure, and somewhere across the city, a 6-year-old girl was still asleep, unaware that her father had spent the last 3 nights being exactly the man he'd promised himself. For her sake, he would never have to be again. He had been that man anyway. He didn't yet know what it would cost him to have been seen. The federal agents arrived at 9 a.m., 2 of them, unremarkable in gray suits that made Reyes's team look almost theatrical by comparison. They spoke with hospital administration first, then with Reyes, then, finally, with Ethan in a small conference room, usually reserved for family consultations, with a box of tissues still sitting untouched on the table, from whatever grief it had last been furnished for. "Mr. Cole," the older agent said, sliding a folder across the table that Ethan recognized instantly by its color coding, even upside down. "We're not here to make trouble for you. We're here because Marcus Reyes filed a report that used the phrase former special operations personnel present and engaged. And given your service record, we needed to have a conversation before this becomes something neither of us wants it to become. How much do you already know?" "Enough. 3 deployments. A citation you never picked up in person. A separation that happened quietly, the way most of the quiet ones do." The agent's voice wasn't unkind. "We're not asking you to explain why you left that life behind, Mr. Cole. We're asking what you want to happen next." Ethan thought of Mia's cereal bowl, washed and drying on the rack every morning before he woke. Thought of the shoebox on the top shelf of his closet, closed again, exactly as he'd left it. "I want my name kept out of any statement," he said. "I want to go back to my job. I don't want reporters finding my daughter's school." The younger agent glanced at his partner, then back at Ethan. "That's easier to arrange than you'd think. Officially, hospital security neutralized both threats with the assistance of alert staff. No individual credited by name. Whitfield's people are motivated to keep this quiet too. Bad press for a company mid-acquisition fight." He paused. "Off the record, though the work you did piecing together Kestrel Solutions, ownership trail in 48 hours, was better than what my analysts produced in a week. If you ever want a very different kind of job, I don't. The agent nodded slowly, as if he'd expected exactly that answer, and respected it more for having asked anyway. Understood. They left an hour later, and with them went the last thread that could have unraveled the careful, quiet life Ethan had spent 3 years building. Warren Whitfield found him near the end of his shift, standing outside the supply room, still in his scrubs, looking every bit the unremarkable nurse he'd always appeared to be. Whitfield was a tall man, silver head, carrying himself with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent a week discovering how little his money could actually protect. They wouldn't give me your name, Whitfield said. Reyes wouldn't either. I had to ask around the floor, until 3 different nurses independently described the same man. I'd appreciate it if it stayed that way. My daughter is alive because of you twice. Whitfield's voice caught slightly. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Let me do something. A house. A trust fund for your family. Anything. Ethan considered the offer honestly, the way he considered most things, turning it over, weighing what it would cost against what it might fix. He thought of Mia, of the cramped apartment, of the promotions he'd turned down because they came with hours that would take him away from her mornings. There is one thing, he said. Whitfield leaned forward, visibly relieved to have something to offer. Name it. There's a scholarship fund at Ridgeview for nursing students who can't afford the program. It's underfunded. Put your money there, in your daughter's name, not mine. Ethan met his eyes. That's the only thing I'll accept. Whitfield stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, not just gratitude now, but a kind of bewildered respect for a man who had just been offered nearly anything, and asked for something that would never trace back to himself. You could have asked for so much more. I already have what I need, Ethan said, and meant it. Marcus Reyes caught him in the parking garage as Ethan was heading to his car at the end of the shift. The early light thin and gray over the concrete. Whitfield's keeping his team on for another month, just as a precaution, Reyes said. After that, I'm out. Contract's done. He hesitated, an unusual thing for a man who rarely hesitated at anything. I meant what I said in there. If you ever want work that uses what you actually are, instead of hiding it. I have work, Marcus. I have a daughter who needs picking up from school every day at 3:15. Ethan managed something close to a smile, tired but genuine. That's not hiding. That's the life I chose. Reyes studied him, then nodded, extending his hand one final time. For what it's worth, Cole, whatever unit you came from, they'd have been proud of what you did in that hospital. Not the fighting, the choosing not to, until you absolutely had to. Ethan shook his hand and said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say, that wouldn't feel too large for a parking garage at dawn. He drove to Mia's school 40 minutes later, parked in the same spot he always parked in, and watched her run out through the doors with her backpack, half open, and a drawing. Clutched in one hand, a nurse and a little girl, stick figures holding hands beneath a badly drawn sun. I made this for you, she said, climbing into the car, thrusting the paper toward him with the fierce pride only 6-year-olds could manage. Because you always take care of people. Ethan took the drawing, looked at it for a long moment, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight for 3 straight days. Thank you, sweetheart, he said quietly. That's exactly right. He didn't tell her about the hospital, about the 2 nights that had nearly cost him everything he'd spent 3 years protecting. He simply pulled out of the parking lot, drove home the long way past the park she liked, and let the quiet return, earned this time, chosen this time, the way it had always been meant to be. 3 weeks later, Ridgeview Memorial looked exactly as it always had. The 4th floor had returned to its ordinary rhythms. Soft alarms, quiet footsteps, the low hum of machines keeping people alive through the long hours between midnight and dawn. Room 412 held a different patient now, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery, and nothing about the room suggested it had ever been anything other than what it was, a place where people got better. Ethan Cole moved through the corridor with a tray of medication in one hand and a tablet in the other, his footsteps unhurried, his eyes flicking once over every doorway he passed. Room 402, stable. Room 404, sedated, breathing even. It was, in every visible way, the same job it had always been. Marcus Reyes's contract had ended, as promised, 2 weeks earlier. Ethan hadn't heard from him since, though a single postcard had arrived at the hospital addressed simply to Cole. I see you, no return address. Just a short line in careful handwriting, still keeping watch, wherever I am. Hope you're doing the same, quietly, the way it should be done. Ethan had read it twice, and then folded it into the same drawer, where he kept the things that mattered too much to display. Sophia Whitfield had been discharged 11 days after the second attack. walking out of the hospital flanked by a much smaller, much calmer security detail. Her father's hand on her shoulder the entire way. She'd stopped by the nurse's station on her way out, looking for someone she never found. Ethan had traded his shift that morning on purpose, unwilling to stand in a hallway and be thanked for something he needed, for his own sake, to let become ordinary again. She'd left a note instead, sealed in an envelope, handed to Priya with instructions to give it only to the nurse, who checked my vitals the first week. Ethan had opened it alone in the stairwell, the same stairwell where all of this had truly started. I don't know your whole story, and I don't think you want me to. But I know what it's like now to be underestimated by people who think quiet means weak. I won't forget what you did. I won't tell anyone either, if that's what you need. Thank you for seeing me when I needed someone to. He'd read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same drawer as Reyes's postcard. Not hidden exactly, just kept, the way a man kept the few things that had earned the right to matter without needing to be seen by anyone else. Warren Whitfield's donation to the Nursing Scholarship Fund had been announced publicly. 2 weeks later, a substantial gift, made in his daughter's name, crediting no individual for the events that had prompted it. The hospital board had quietly tried to identify the staff member involved in the incident, curious enough to ask around. But the trail always seemed to grow vague, right at the point where it should have led to Ethan Cole. Priya, when asked directly by an administrator, had simply shrugged and said, "Cole's a good nurse, calm under pressure. That's about all I know." It was, in its way, the truest thing anyone had said about him in weeks. At 3 a.m., during his 15-minute break, Ethan sat alone in the stairwell and opened a photo on his phone. Mia, 6 years old, holding up a spelling test with a gold star on it, grinning the same gap-toothed grin she'd worn in the school carnival photo weeks earlier. He kept the photo up longer than 90 seconds, this time, a full 3 minutes, unhurried, unafraid of the ache of it, because for the first time in a long while, the ache didn't feel like something he had to carry alone through the rest of his shift. He thought, briefly, about the shoebox on the top shelf of his closet. He hadn't opened it again since that first night. He suspected he wouldn't need to for a long while, not because the man in that box was gone, but because Ethan finally understood, something he hadn't fully accepted before all of this happened. That man had never really left. He had simply been waiting, quietly, for the moment when he'd be needed again, and when that moment came, he had done exactly what he was trained to do, and then, just as deliberately, stepped back into the quiet. That was the discipline nobody saw, not the fight. The return, he finished his coffee, checked his watch, and walked back down the hallway to finish his rounds, checking charts no one asked him to check twice, adjusting for lines before machines could even flag the problem, moving through the building with the same unremarkable competence that had defined him for 3 years, and would go on defining him for as many more as this life required. Nobody on the floor that night knew what he had done 3 weeks earlier. Nobody would. That had never been the point. At 8:40 the next morning, he walked Mia to school, her small hand in his, her voice filling the quiet the way it always did, telling him about a book her class was reading, about a friend who'd moved to a new house, about nothing at all, and everything that mattered. "Daddy," she said, as they reached the school gate, "are you a superhero?" He looked down at her, startled by the question, and felt something in his chest tighten and release in the same breath. "No, sweetheart," he said, crouching down to her eye level. The same calm in his voice he brought to every room he'd ever needed to steady. "I'm just a nurse who takes care of people. That's all I need to be." She grinned, satisfied with the answer, and ran through the gate toward her classroom without looking back. Ethan watched her go until she disappeared inside, then turned and walked back the way he'd come. An ordinary man, in an ordinary morning, disappearing again into a life built entirely around never needing to be anything more than what the world could see. It was, he had come to understand, its own kind of strength. The kind that never asked to be noticed. The kind that simply showed up, quietly, every single time it was needed, and then, just as quietly, walked away. END.